God's existence in order to follow Kant's system. And the other reason we go over Kantian ethics is it gives you a very good example of the other main type of moral theory, which is a deontological or non-consequentialist moral theory. I mean, the theories that are called theories of obligation, and I'm not going to ask you that term, but the ethical theories that that are not like Aristotle's and worrying about character, but the ones that worry about giving us some sort of decision procedure about how to figure out what to do in a given thorny situation. Those fit into two broad classes, and utilitarianism gives us an example of a theory from one of those classes, the class that says only consequences need to be taken into account to figure out moral right and wrong. Just the results of what we do. Nothing else matters. And of course, that's what the consequentialist moral theories say. But Kant's theory fits into a broad category called non-consequentialist or deontological. Those are two words for the same thing. Now you got to be a little careful here. While consequentialist theories claim that only consequences matter, nothing else, as far as figuring out moral right and wrong. Non-consequentialist theories run a sort of continuum or gamut. In other words, to be a non-consequentialist, all you have to do is deny the consequentialist claim that only consequences matter. And so having said that, it's possible to be a non-consequentialist and hold that consequences do matter. They should be taken into account, but factors other than consequences also matter. And one of the criticisms of utilitarianism that we went over is that it makes the past irrelevant. It makes the past morally irrelevant. Why? Because it focuses entirely on consequences, and all of the consequences for our actions are rooted in the future. So if only consequences matter, then only the future matters. Nothing about the past. But some of us think that, well, you know, suppose it's morally right. You know, suppose I'm up for a promotion and there's somebody else who's also up for a promotion at some job, maybe the supervisor, and I think I've done the best job over the years and have the best past record. Well, utilitarianism cannot capture the notion of desert, that you deserve something, either good or bad. You know, they might say, well, okay, a society is better off if it rewards people with promotions who did a good job in the past, or maybe did the best job. But it cannot look back at your past record in a job and say, you know what, you deserve the promotion over person B on the basis of your past performance in that job. And similarly, now this is a real contrived philosopher's example, but it does get across this point. Suppose it's morally relevant that I keep a promise. I might have given you this one last time because I sometimes bring it up during the objections. But, again, I apologize if this is deja vu all over again. But, I mean, suppose you're at the bedside of a dying man, a dying acquaintance who's much older than you. And he says, you know what? I only have one relative in this world, that's my nephew. And I know I haven't got long. So, and you're kind of a Benthamite utilitarian, right? And so he says, you know what, I have $50,000 stuffed into this mattress. My life savings. I want you to promise me that you're going to take that $50,000 and give it to my nephew. Suppose you make that promise, and for you want to do the right thing, okay? And you know the right thing is not keeping the money yourself, okay? Much as you would be tempted to do. And so you promise him that you're going to take that money and give it to his nephew, but then you get to thinking about it and realize that his nephew is kind of a playboy type, If he takes that money, he's liable to blow it on wine, women, and song, right? He might make a few croupiers in Las Vegas happy, but he's not going to use that money to, in any way, greatly benefit society. Well, utilitarianism can justify breaking that promise, even though you made it. The reason they have this illustration where you're making the promise to the dying man is only you and he know about the promise. You're not going to weaken the societal institution of promise, making if you break the promise to this man. Only you and he knew about it. But you get to thinking, I can bring about much more good if I take that money and give it to, say, a children's hospital rather than giving it to his nephew. And it seems like most brands of utilitarianism could justify breaking a promise if you can bring about more good than bad results by doing so. But now, if your intuition say, well, wait a second, you did make a promise. You promised the guy, and after all, number one, it was his money. I ought to respect his property rights, and I ought to respect his own decision, whether I agree with it or not, to do what he wants to with his own personal property. And if he wanted it given to his nephew, then I should respect that and I should keep my promise. Well, the point is, if you're looking back at a promise, and that's the reason why you're doing A rather than B, the reason why you're giving the $50,000 to his nephew rather than the children's hospital is because you made a promise. Where was the promise made? Well, it was made in the past. Okay, but utilitarianism cannot capture stuff like this. And so what you're saying is, even though it might bring about fewer good consequences for all concerned, for me to take that money and give it to his profligate nephew, nonetheless, the right thing to do is to do that simply because I ought to keep my promise. And so, non-consequentialist theories can capture this. So what we're saying is there's an aspect about the situation that does not amount to consequences that is relevant to the morality of what you do. So non-consequentialist theories assert that factors other than consequences may determine, when I say the moral quality, basically it's whether what you do is morally right or morally wrong. Sorry, wrong. And so, now, as I said, non-consequentialist theories can run the gamut, and what we're going to see is that Kant is on the complete other end of the spectrum from the consequentialists. Kant takes an extreme view on non-consequentialism. And that is that his view is that consequences don't matter at all. Now, as I said, not every non-consequentialist theory holds that. There are intermediate positions, and it's really kind of beyond the scope of what we do in Philosophy 101 to worry about that. But so the other word, and it isn't like we're going to dwell on this, but there might be a question on it. Deon or deontos in Greek means duty. So the reason for calling these theories deontological theories is that they claim to show us our moral duty apart from consequences. Hence the name deontological. Claim that our moral duty is shown to us by these theories by factors other than the consequences of our actions. But essentially, these are two big 50-cent words for the same thing. Again, your parents say, well, what did you do in class today? You say, well, we discussed deontological moral theories. Throw that word out there, and they'll think that their tuition money is going for a good cause. Kant is a little harder to understand than the utilitarians on this notion of moral goodness. And we saw that philosophers can have varying concepts, right? We've already seen that Plato wants to put moral goodness in a completely otherworldly standard, the form of the good, or goodness itself, in the realm of in the intelligible world outside the cave. We saw that Aristotle was more practical, and he's closer to the utilitarians, right? Aristotle wants happiness, but it's a slightly different take on happiness than the old-time Greek hedonists. We saw that the utilitarians want to be hedonists, many of them. Kant is a little harder to understand. He does reject hedonism. And here I think we see some of his Protestant religious convictions coming out. I mean, basically, Kant thinks that, well, you know what? I mean, the goal of morality is not necessarily to provide happiness for all, because not everyone even deserves happiness. He thinks it's only people who are living a moral life that deserve happiness in this life or the afterlife. So pleasure is not the only good in itself. And he focuses on one thing, and it's not pleasure, but it's a goodwill. In other words, he says that there's nothing good without qualification in this world or the next than a good human will. In other words, it is with our will that we choose to do A rather than B. Now, if this were a longer ethics class, we would go into some subtleties about this, but to hit the high points, it's possible to cite quotations, though I won't, from both Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, where they specifically say that motive is not important. In other words, as long as you're aiming as a utilitarian to bring about the best consequences, the greatest good for the greatest number, it does not matter what your motive in doing so is. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it because you really have compassionate feelings, say for people that you want to help, food aid to third world nations or something. It doesn't matter if your motive in doing so is to get a promotion in your job, or to help your family, or even to make more money. It does not matter. From a utilitarian perspective, you do the right thing if you aim to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number in terms of consequences, and your motive in wanting to do that is morally irrelevant. Now, here is a place where Kant is on the absolute other end of the spectrum. For Kant, motive is everything. In other words, the difference between doing something that's morally praiseworthy and something that is not is totally revolves around the motive you had for doing it. So for Kant, it's important not only that we do the right thing, but that we do the right thing for the right motive. And motive ties up directly with a good will. So in other words, for Kant, a good will is a will that is motivated correctly to do what it does. That not only does the right thing, but does the right thing for the right reason. So a good will is a properly motivated human will. And again, let me say that this PowerPoint I basically made up following Kant's own presentation, and his groundwork on metaphysics of morals, that little book. So now here's where Kant gets a little controversial. He rejects egoistic motives that have to do with self-interest, which are prudential motives. I mean, suppose I like ties, and you can see by how often I wear them how much I like ties, which is I don't. But I mean, suppose I'm in Macy's where, a tie might cost you $85. Right, and I'm looking at some ties and I think, well, that's a nice tie, but I don't have $85. I think, well, I mean, I could kind of slip this tie in my coat and maybe nobody would notice, and I'd have a brand new tie. But then I think, well, maybe there's a security camera I haven't seen. Maybe that person 2 aisles over who looks like just another shopper is really a plainclothes store detective. You know what? Things could go very badly for me if I were caught shoplifting, and had that on my record. You know what? I think I'm going to ditch that idea of ripping this tie off. And so you do the right thing. You're honest. You don't steal the tie, right? But Kant would say, well, you did the right thing, but you did the right thing for a motive that is not morally praiseworthy at all. You did it to save your own, skin. You did it for a totally self-centered, prudential motive. I mean, it's like the person who doesn't cheat on the test because they're afraid they might get caught. So, for Kant, self-interested motives are of no moral worth. Now, we're going to see when we look at how Kant wants us to decide things that he wants us to use a rational test to figure out the right thing to do that has to do with something we figure out inside of ourselves. He wants our will to be determined, and his word is autonomously. And I'm going to go back to that meaning of autonomous, but just to bring out a point about it, we use autonomous in a number of different ways, with a number of different connotations. I mean, at the beginning of a philosophy course, sometimes part of my speech is to say, well, I'm not going to tell you what to think on some of these issues. We're going to look at diverse perspectives, and I'm going to let you be autonomous, decide for yourself who you think has the best case, or if anybody has a good case that we study. But you know what auto is, right, by itself, right? An automobile is something that that's mobile by itself, right? The Greek word for law is nomos. The most literal meaning of the word autonomous is a law unto ourselves. Now, you gotta understand, Kant is not the kind of relativist that we call a subjectivist who says, hey, whatever my personal call about right and wrong is right, whatever my own values are, they need no justification other than the fact that they're my values. Kant's not a relativist of that sort, but he thinks that we can discover what he thinks is an absolute moral law ourselves, using the rational test that we're going to see he calls the categorical imperative. So he wants our will to do A or to do B to be determined by this rational test we do in our own minds internally, not by external factors like consequences. Now, I'm not going to put the word up on the board, but he calls them heteronymous determiners of the will. Determiners of the will that are outside of us and that are many. He wants us to be autonomous. Now, here's where even Kantians think Kant might have gone too far in the direction of the rational. Remember, some of these people are reacting, the utilitarians and the Kantians are both reacting in their own ways to David Hume's skepticism about morality, where Hume says morality is more a matter of the sensitive rather than the rational part of our nature, that we cannot really reason about a moral issue. And Kant in his own way and the utilitarians in their own way are trying to get back in response to that kind of skepticism that says values aren't even something we can reason about. They're matters of taste. I mean, if I prefer chocolate ice cream to pistachio, it isn't like you know, I am obligated to give you a reasoned explanation for why, you know, you ought to prefer chocolate ice cream over pistachio. It's a matter of taste. Well, Hume's view on morality and values is they're just a matter of taste. You know, you can't reason about them, but the utilitarians and the Kantians and a lot of contemporary ethicists are saying, you know, we need to get back this idea that we can have rational discussions and disagreements over moral issues, that reason matters. And for Kant, motives centered on feelings or even inclination are not morally praiseworthy. In other words, the kind of person who is just inclined toward doing good things for others, for Kant, that's no more morally praiseworthy than if they were inclined to do things for others simply because they get a psychological high out of it, you know, simply for self-interested reasons. Now, most people think that this is wrong. I mean, if you want to help the people next door who had a fire in their house, you know, because you care for those people, you've known them for years, you know, and you really can empathize with their situation, you know, for Kant, that really is not a morally praiseworthy motive. In fact, he talks about a philanthropist who has the ability, still has money, but has a lot of problems of his own, right? Somebody comes to him for help, and he is not inclined, he doesn't want to hear it. He's got problems of his own. He's not inclined to want to do anything for them, but Kant says if he tears himself out of this dead insensibility and say he whips out his checkbook and solves their problem, which can be solved by money, not because he wants to help them, he doesn't even want to be bothered with them right now. He's got enough troubles of his own. Not because he's inclined to do so, but solely because he thinks he has an abstract duty to be benevolent to his fellow human beings when they're asking for help. Kant says it's then and only then that what he does has moral worth. So that brings us to the next slide. Then, if the only way we can be moral according to Kant is to act from the right motive, then what is the right motive? If it's not the other ones we just looked at, it's an abstract motive of duty. In other words, acting on principle, doing the right thing simply because it's right and for no other reason. And specifically, it's doing the right thing irrespective of the consequences that might result. So, only actions for Kant done from duty then are morally praiseworthy. Acting from duty then means doing something because it's right regardless of consequences. But of course, this raises the obvious question. Well, if the only way I could be moral is to act from duty, well, how do I know what my duty is? And here's where this internal rational test that Kant gives the big word, the categorical imperative, comes into play. But you got to bring Kant down to earth here, okay? Yeah, he uses a lot of 50-cent words, a lot of highfalutin terminology, right? But at rock bottom, all he's trying to do is get out good old-fashioned golden rule ethics in a more philosophically defensible way. In other words, what Kant is telling us basically is, oh, look, you want to know what to do, what's the right thing to do, follow the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and you're going to be fine. Except that he gives us a much more complicated statement of that. So, and here's again why Kant's theory has become so popular as a modern theory of secular ethicists, or for secular ethicists, because you can use the system Kant gave us solely by using your rational powers, and you do not have to bring in any theological considerations whatsoever. So it's by a reason that we supposedly use our duty. Now, our duty for Kant is given by abstract principles, moral rules. But Kant doesn't think that any kind of moral rule can form a good, solid basis for morality. He does not like the kinds of moral rules utilitarians would use because you can get out of them too easily. Utilitarians use, now an imperative is what? I mean, if I give you an imperative, you know, take the exam on the 13th. That's basically a command, right? I mean, and so there are two types of moral commands, and most system of ethics use what Kant calls hypothetical commands, hypothetical imperatives. He wants commands that are not hypothetical, that are categorical. What's the difference? Well, a hypothetical is an if-then statement, right? So a hypothetical command says if you want to bring about a certain condition or a certain state of affairs, then do A or don't do B. You know, so a hypothetical imperative is a command that rests on a condition. If you want to bring about C, a particular condition, then do A. In other words, they don't say do A or always do A or never do A. They say if you want to bring about a certain state of affairs. Again, for Kant, these are an insufficient moral basis because he thinks we can whittle out of our duty too easily with hypothetical imperatives. They're easily rejected by the person who does not want to realize the condition. And they depend on human wants, and that's what makes them an insufficient basis for duty. Here's an example of a hypothetical imperative. Note the imperative is you should or you ought to dress professionally. But note, it's a command that rests on a condition. If you want to get hired, you ought to dress professionally. An example, I like to modify it because I'm a backgammon player, not a chess player. But, you know, this guy named Bill Roberti has written some good books on backgammon. Really, the one that everybody's reading now was written by Walter Trice. So let's say Walter Trice. If I say, if you want to become a better backgammon player, then you ought to read Backgammon Boot Camp by Walter Trice. Now you say, you know what? He's given me an imperative. I ought to read that book. Now, how of having to read Backgammon Boot Camp by Walter Trice. I mean, this is not rocket science. What's the most obvious?
Not read it.
Pardon?
Not read it.
Well, not read it, but I mean, how could you argue that you do not have that obligation?
If you're just not really trying to become a good backgammon player, I mean, it's not really.
Exactly. That's the bottom line. If I say, look, I'm not interested in becoming a backgammon player, much less a better one. So you no longer have that obligation, right? If you don't care whether you get hired or not, you can tell I use these sometimes in business ethics. You can dress any way you want to, right? So you can get out of them simply by claiming that you're not interested in bringing about the condition that's attached to the command. Now, to give you a simple example of how this relates to a moral hypothetical imperative, one of the things that the Benthamite Peter Singer has argued is that we all ought to feel morally obligated, if we're good utilitarians, to give till it hurts for third world famine relief. Why? Because if your aim is to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number, suppose you're thinking about maybe taking $2,000 that you've saved up and buying a new flat screen TV for the fall football season. Maybe that's okay, it's a guide illustration, but you see where I'm coming at. Okay, you're going to get some enjoyment out of it, and so are some of your friends, but it wouldn't have, that $2,000 would not have the impact for all concerned that it might have if you instead took the money and gave it, say, to World Vision or to some, or Oxfam or one of these NGOs that helps people out in famine relief. So here's Peter Singer saying, hey, you have a moral obligation to give till it hurts for third world famine relief. Forget about that flat screen TV. Take that $2,000 and give it to Oxfam or World Vision. So how can you get out of it? Well, you can get out of it if you realize that that command is a utilitarian command that rests on the condition that you bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. And you say, well, you know what, Peter Singer, I'm not particularly interested in bringing about the greatest good for the greatest number. I don't think that's the basis of my moral convictions. So there goes your obligation, to give till it hurts for third world famine relief based on utilitarian principles. So that's an example of a moral imperative that's a conditional one, that's a hypothetical one. So how do you get the non-hypothetical ones? Well, here's where Kant wants us to use this internal rational test, following what he calls the categorical imperative. Commands that state our obligation categorically say, do A, don't do B, always do A, no's, ifs, ands, or buts, right? So Kant thinks these are the kinds of moral rules we ought to have. Ones that are not conditional, ones that are categorical, and as the title in my first slide says, we need some pretty much absolute moral rules, not ones that are relative to a condition. So you can get out of your duty if you just don't want to realize the condition. And he says it's only by using this test that he calls the categorical imperative that we can figure out what they are. Now, one of the things, one of the courses I took in my graduate career was a whole graduate seminar, a whole semester on Kantian ethics, okay? And a lot of ink has been spilled in professional philosophical journals over whether the two statements Kant gives of the categorical imperative really amount to the same thing as Kant claimed they did. There are two basic statements of this, and they sound very different. The first one's the most abstract, and they're called formulations by philosophers, call them the first and second formulation of the categorical imperative. And so what's the first one? Again, these are not pages in your book, but we ought, or one ought always to act only on that maxim which one can, without contradiction, imagine everyone acting. In other words, I want to do something, I need to ask myself, is what I'm thinking of doing something I want everybody to be doing in this situation? And if your answer is no, Kant would say, well, it's probably not something you should be doing either, if you wouldn't be willing to have everybody act the way you're thinking of acting. So what is a maxim? The first freeze-dried coffee that ever came on the market when I was still a kid was called Maxim. But this has nothing to do with coffee. A maxim for Kant is basically the thought that we have in mind when we make a decision using our will to do A or to do B. I mean, suppose I, promise to meet you downtown for lunch on Friday, right? And so it's Friday morning, and I'm getting things done, but then I say, it's getting toward lunchtime. I promised so-and-so I'd meet her for lunch. I ought to keep my promises. That thought, I ought to keep my promises. That thought that motivates me to drop what I'm doing and go downtown and meet you for lunch because I promised to do it, is what Kant calls a maxim. It's the subjective internal thought, internal rule I'm following when I am making a specific moral decision. So what is he saying in this first version of it, or formulation of the categorical imperative? That I should act on a maxim like keep my promises as my moral duty only if I can also imagine everyone else being required to do the same. So basically, if I can keep my promise to meet you downtown for lunch and also think, everybody ought to be required to keep their promises in the way that I'm doing now, then I've got a rule that passes the test of the categorical imperative. And so this is how you get the universal rules. If I can imagine everybody being required to do what I'm thinking of doing, then always keep your promises would be a universal rule of morality that everyone ought to follow. And so the categorical imperative gives me this universal principle, always keep your promises. Now notice, it says always keep your promises, no ifs, ands, or buts, no conditions. And so that's how this test gives us these, not conditional, but these unconditional, these categorical moral rules. So always always keep your promises is something that I've discovered by using the rational tests of the categorical imperative as part of my moral duty. So in other words, I'm using the categorical imperative to be autonomous, to give myself the moral law by figuring out what principles pass the test. And those are, for Kant, the principles I ought to be following. Now, not every principle passes this test, and I'm not going to go into all of these, but the one that Kant really focuses on, and we saw this in the video, is promising falsely to get a loan. Right? Another one would be just making promises from selfish reasons. But if I promise falsely to get a loan, Kant says, what would happen if everybody did that? Well, basically, you reach a point where people would wise up. That people are promising, to get loans. And really something like this happened in the subprime mortgage market, where a lot of people were making promises to get loans that they weren't able to keep, but there are other things going on. It wasn't entirely their fault sometimes. Things were made available too easily. But the point is, Kant says, yeah, from my own self-interest, I could make a lying promise to get a loan, but I could not at the same time will that everybody do so, because the whole thing would defeat itself. Or an example, one of the things that Lee Iacocca, way back in the 90s when they did the Chrysler bailout, he said, you know what, folks, this factory, we're going to have it open at least another 5 years. Don't believe what you've heard, and he closed it within a year. I suppose I owned a factory and I knew that I was going to close the factory in 6 months, but I needed my employees around to get done what I think needs to be done in the factory in the next 6 months before we can close it. So I know if I let them know that I'm planning on closing the factory in 6 months, they're going to start looking for other jobs elsewhere. And they're going to leave me, some of them. But I need them around, so instead I make a lying promise to them. Hey, don't believe what you've heard. We are not going to close. We're here for the long term. So suppose if I said, if it's to the advantage of my business and me personally, I'll extend promises to my employees that I do not intend to keep. Well, here again, if all employers did this, nobody, I could follow it privately from self-interest. I could make a false promise to get a loan from self-interest. But Kant says I could not consistently at the same time will that everyone be required to make these kinds of false promises. The whole thing would be self-defeating. Now here's where I emphasize the subtlety. So if everyone were to do so, such promises would stop being accepted to the point where no promises could continue to be made. In other words, there would be a contradiction between what I want to do myself and what I'm able to say I want everybody to be able to do. And it's this contradiction that Kant is looking for. In other words, there's a conflict of will between what I would will for myself. I want to make a false promise to my employees. I want to make a false promise to get the money there's a contradiction between what I would will for myself and what I would will for everybody else. And this is what Kant is after, this internal logical conflict between what I can consistently will for everybody versus what I want to do. Because it sounds like Kant here is a consequentialist. Like Kant is saying, hey, look, the consequences for society of people making lying promises are so bad that we ought to tell the truth. Now, that's a utilitarian story, but that's not what Kant is saying. He's saying, no, I'm after this conflict of will, this logical contradiction, and that has nothing to do with consequences. It's that there's a contradiction between what I would will for myself as the maxim I'm following and what I would universalize that maxim to be. So you would fail the test of the categorical imperative by making a false promise. Now, the second one is much more down to earth. We have about 4 or 5 minutes. Always act so as to treat others as an end and never only as a means to our ends. This one's a little easier to see as equivalent to the golden rule. In other words, we wouldn't want to just be used by somebody just for their own good in a way that overlooks our good and our interests. So we oughtn't to use other people in that way. Now, Kant here is much closer to Aristotle than he is to somebody like Bentham. Remember, Bentham says, you want to ask whether we have any direct duties to non-human animals. All you got to ask is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? Can they feel pain? If they can, we have duties to them to keep that from happening. But Kant is much closer to Aristotle and Aquinas in thinking that it's human rational abilities that make them unique. He believes that human beings uniquely have the ability to know what their duty is using their reasoning powers, and also to act on principle. Even a non-human animal will do the right thing for prudential reasons, right? My cat starts to claw on something like the banister, and I yell at it, and it stops, right? It's doing the right thing, but for a prudential motive. It doesn't want to get punished. But human beings have the ability to act on principle. In other words, my cat is not capable of saying, well, you know what? It is true that Vic owns this house, and Vic has certain property rights, and I would be violating his property rights by scratching the banister. So I ought to respect his private property and not scratch the banister. My cat is incapable of acting on principle. And so Kant says, because we can and non-human animals can't, this puts us in a different moral category from them. So just a few more slides, and we'll pick this up. So it makes humans special. They alone then can be autonomous. They can rationally give the law to themselves and act on principle. So he says they have a right to have their autonomous choices respected by other people. So to respect somebody's preferences and rational choices is to treat them, in Kant's terminology, as an end in themselves. not as a mere means. Well, I think this is a good place to stop. But we've gone through most of it. But what we're going to do next time then is, again, the talk is entirely optional, but we will begin at the beginning of the period and do as much as people want to do in terms of the presentation. Again, you want to make sure that you can find the clip easily on the internet, or that you know what clip on a DVD is, so we can, just kind of roll along smoothly. And so we'll do that for next time, and then I'll finish up a little bit of this, and then maybe we'll do some review. What we're going to review is mostly sharing it. Okay, thank you. If somebody could turn in the roll, and again, I gave